Great, thank you, Gwen. So my name's Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester. What that means, if you haven't heard of us before, county foresters, there's 13 of us for Vermont's 14 counties, and we do a few different things. We are basically the way that the state supports the management of private lands. So Vermont's about 75% forested. 80% of those private lands, or 80% of those forests are owned by private landowners. And so it's a pretty important and big job to support those landowners. And we are all, as I know, and as I'm sure all of you know, forests are the most important thing in the world. And so we really, really value the resources that those forests provide, which I'll be talking more about later. And so helping people manage their privately owned forested lands is really important. Just to give you the brief rundown on what county foresters do, the first big thing we do is we manage the current use program, also called the Use Value Appraisal Program, in our respective counties. This is a tax abatement program for landowners who have more than 25 acres of forested land, and they basically agree not to subdivide or develop their land. In exchange for that, they get a tax break, and they have to follow a forest management plan, which is approved by and monitored by the county foresters. That's a big part of our job, where we spend a lot of our time. Second part of our job is that we are just a resource for private landowners. If you own a couple of acres or a couple thousand acres, it doesn't matter. We are here to assist you in understanding your forest, understanding how to manage your forests for many different things. Your forest is important, and we just want to recognize that with our time. The third thing is that we manage municipal forests, town forests, community forests, and we help towns manage these assets in some way. How the amount that different county foresters do that varies from county to county. I really, really like managing town forests, so I do a lot of work with them. And then the fourth thing is just sort of addressing this question of how we make forest management in our county better, and how we make our forests in our county healthier. And so that's where we get to be creative and get to sort of respond to what's going on in an individual county in a sort of creative, thoughtful way. These counties are all really different, and so how we address that question will vary. And so I'm excited to have you here to do this presentation, to see me do this presentation, and because it's something that I'm really excited about how we understand the forest management work that we do and the forest that we have in a broader context, and the way it fits into how we craft a better world. And so with that, I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation. All right, so I call this the radical forest manager. One of the other county foresters told me it reminded them of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But what the radical forest manager is really about is these two things. So these are two different definitions of the word radical, and both of them are applicable to what I want to get at with this presentation. So the first is relating to or affecting the fundamental nature of something, far-reaching, thorough, very different from the traditional or usual, favoring extreme changes in existing views, habits, conditions, or institutions. So a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about, or the way that I want you to sort of think about the management of our forests, may be really, really different from how you're used to thinking about forest management or logging. This is meant to be a way to sort of reframe the work that we're doing, not to say that the way that I think about managing forests is better than anyone else, but just to say that this is a way of thinking about it that I think really puts it in perspective, with respect to a few different things, which I'm going to mention a little bit later. And then the other aspect of this that makes it radical is advocating for this sort of this other more modern definition, where it's taken on these other ideas of advocating for political, social change, political, economic, social reforms. This is sort of the idea of something radical as being attached to these sort of broader political or economic or social ideas. And that is also something that I want to bring forest management into. see here. So these are what I call the principles of the radical forest manager. So the first thing, and really the most important thing, is that you zoom out. So understand that your forest and the work that you're doing in your forest is relevant not only in this sort of tiny little box of your property or of your town or of your county or your state, but it's important to place that in both historical, ecological, and social contexts. It's also really important that you continue to be educated. I expect that's what many of you are doing right now, is just sort of continuing to be curious and educated about how to think about forests and how to manage them. Stay open, stay informed, and stay humble, and understand that to be a really, really good forest steward, you have to be willing to sort of turn those preconceptions and ideas that you have about forests and their management over in your mind. I think it's also really important that we recognize collective responsibility. So one of the really important things about this is understanding that forests are supplying us with these massive public benefits, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And so your actions may be relevant not just to you, not just to your forest that you own or that you appreciate, but actually more broadly, to your neighbors, and then in a global context as well. And then finally, I think it's really, really important to understand that you have to be willing to make tough decisions that you don't think right now that you should have to make or that feel comfortable to you in order to do the right thing. That's also really, really important. And so let's think about forests. So what is a forest? And this is, if you look, just what is a forest on the internet, these are some of the definitions you get. You get a large area covered chiefly with trees and undergrowth. You get a dense growth of trees and shrubs covering a large area full of trees, usually wild. All of these are basically definitions which are defining forests based on them being like a bunch of trees. So is that what a forest is? I would argue that a modern definition of a forest is more in line with this definition of what we call a natural community. This is a definition from the book Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, which is an amazing resource by some local Vermont authors, Liz Thompson, Eric Sorensen, with a new edition with Bob Zano also as an author. They define a natural community as an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. So it's a broader definition where it's not just saying, if you got a bunch of trees, you've got a forest. It's saying that trees are also many different kinds of organisms, and even their physical environment, the site where they're growing, and even the natural processes themselves that are affecting them as they grow and change over time. So I think what you'll see is that forests are not a static or unchanging place. They are this incredibly dynamic, really process more than they are just a bunch of trees growing in a place. And so I call this moving from a tree-based framework to a forest-based framework. So we're trying to basically manage forests not as a bunch of individual trees, but as a system within which trees are really important, but trees are certainly not the only thing that are important. I sort of will have several quotes by Aldo Leopold, who I really, really love, to sort of guide us through this presentation. This is one that's really special. He says, "Only those who know the most about land can appreciate how little we know about it. If the biota in the course of eons has built something we like but do not understand, then who but a fool will discard seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering." So first, understand that. And many of us may have had an understanding walking through the woods or spending time with the woods that they are systems, and that they do have many different parts, and that the trees are important, but then the wildlife and the plants and the invertebrates, the insects and the fungi and all these other things are also have value and some sort of role in keeping this whole system healthy. And increasingly, science vindicates that point of view. And most recently with like the emergent science about mycorrhizal fungi, the underground networks that connect trees to one another. But in many different areas of science as well, we understand that forests are systems. And so in order to place us in sort of a broader context with that definition, I want to get into some history. If you've heard me speak before, I almost always start my discussion of forests with history because it's so pervasive in the forests that we have and so important to understand them. So Vermont in the 1800s through the early 1900s was a really different place. So European settlers happened upon this state, which was probably in excess of 95% forested. As a result of a bunch of different things, primarily uh, really good markets for wool. There was a bunch of stuff going on, but the biggest factor was the Napoleonic Wars in Europe caused all this chaos, and there was a special type of sheep called the merino sheep, which we all now know, which was basically only in Spain. It was like the King of Spain's private sheep line. And in the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, the United States consul to Portugal, William Jarvis, was able to get his hands on a bunch of these merino sheep and export them to his farm in Wethersfield, Vermont. By the 1830s, there was 1 to 1.7 million merino sheep in Vermont. The wool was much more valuable, it was much more high in quality, and unfortunately, sheep can graze just about anywhere. And so the hillsides of Vermont were cleared, and we think by the mid-1800s, about 80% of Vermont was pasture. And so if you think about that, it's pretty amazing. So you go from 90% forested to 80% deforested in about 50 years. The famous conservationist George Perkins Marsh wrote what's thought to be by some to be the first text in the conservation movement, Man and Nature, in the mid-1800s about seeing this process in Vermont from when he was born, like around 1801, through when he wrote the book in the 1850s. And apparently it was pretty drastic. So to place this into context, 80% deforested, probably the only places that were really not deforested at that time, that were not cleared, were really remote, high elevation forest, stuff like that. So probably almost every forest you've ever been in Vermont was cleared in the early 1800s. And so what does that mean for our forests? So forests are systems. You'll hear me say this again and again. And forests develop over time as systems. So it's not just, a forest is old when there are some old trees there. There are many different attributes of forests that develop over time. And the legacy of the 1800s was that the forests that we have now are in many cases 100 years or less old, and they lack many of the attributes of the old growth forest that preceded this land clearing. So the forests that we have now are younger, they're less diverse, they lack dead wood, they lack carbon. Our landscapes as a whole lack historical balances of young and old forests, different forest types across the landscape. And in general, our forests can be said to be less healthy, less resilient, less productive than the forests that those first European settlers probably found. In addition to this land clearing, what we have since many of our forests have been allowed to revert back from field to forest is also some poor, or I would say short-sighted land management techniques and ideologies. So the first that I like to mention is this idea of the regulated forest. This is largely a German construction. So in Europe, where they had been treating their forests very extractively for a very long time before they sort of came to this new world, they really had to grow wood in the most efficient way possible. And so their idea was they were going to control every single attribute of the forest to grow wood as efficiently as possible. And that was those German forestry techniques were brought over here in the early 1900s. A lot of our forests were managed in that way. What has been found about managing forests that way is that you can grow trees efficiently that way sometimes, but you really can't grow forests that way. Another idea, even up through the late 1900s, was this idea of decadent versus thrifty trees. Decadent trees were just old trees that were no longer growing efficiently, no longer capable of producing like a high-valued sawlog product, and were just considered to be taking up space. Now, we understand now that these old trees and big trees have all these ecological benefits, serving as the hubs of these underground fungal mycorrhizal networks and carbon storage, and also really critical habitat for specific species of birds and mammals. But at that time, they were just considered to be getting in the way, and so they were just killed to make way for what they called thrifty trees, which were smaller diameter trees, which are growing more efficiently and producing more valuable products. There was also widespread, and remains in some parts of the world, widespread high grading. High grading is just where you go in and you cut all the trees that are the most valuable, and you leave all the trees that are less valuable. The problem with high grading is that it's not a long-term strategy which is going to support forest health. You're just cutting the healthiest trees, leaving the least healthy trees, and doing sort of the exact opposite of what we want to do when we're managing forests for them to be healthy and productive in the long term. Diameter limit cuttings, very similar. You just go in and say, I'm going to cut every tree that's bigger than a certain diameter. You end up doing the same thing because the trees that are larger in many cases are growing faster because they're healthier. Also, we saw poor protection of soils, people allowing massive erosion to occur following these logging jobs by not stabilizing trails and stuff like that. And in general, historic forest management focused on simplifying and degrading forests, or at least didn't focus on making them, enriching them in the long term and making them more complex, which we now know to be synonymous with making them healthier. And so wildlife depend on forests. And so as you can imagine, this massive landscape clearing and environmental degradation in our past also had effects on wildlife. And so what you saw in the 1800s was the mass extirpation and extinction of some of our native wildlife species. So in that time, we drove the eastern catamount. This is a picture of the last eastern catamount or eastern puma that was shot in Barnard, I believe, in 1881. Drove those to extinction and drove many other species out of the state. So we lost all of our otter and all of our beaver. We lost our passenger pigeons. We lost our bear. We lost our deer. At that time, we actually had the predominant native ungulates were caribou and a species of elk called eastern elk, which is now extinct. And drove all of these things out of the state by over-harvesting them. In the case of these apex predators, wolves and catamounts, putting bounties on them. In the case of something like beaver, they were considered to be, they had a very valuable pelt. And so we think by this, like 1670, we had shipped 250,000 beaver pelts from the Americas to Europe, basically to be people's fashionable beaver hats. And so, it's just this incredible act of resilience that many of these species are even here, the species that are here are even here anymore. Some of that is as a result of reintroduction. And so beavers were reintroduced in the early 1900s and mid-1900s, and that reintroduction was largely considered a success. It's also important to mention beavers because they're one of these species that we now call a keystone species, a species that creates certain environmental conditions which are help the survival and well-being of many other species. So there are species that with them carry many other species sort of on their backs, so to speak. In the case of beavers, they're making these incredibly important bodies of water, wetland complexes, and supporting all of these birds, amphibians, reptiles, other mammals, stuff like that. The same is true for our apex predators. So, recent experiences with studying wolf reintroduction out west has shown us that actually, in many ways, we always think of these herbivores and species like beaver as driving habitat creation, but we actually know now that apex predators are a huge driver of population or of wildlife habitat as well. And a really interesting thing to think about too, as we think about the way that perhaps those reciprocal impacts that wildlife had on our forests, is to think about something like the passenger pigeon. This is a quote by John James Audubon. He actually has an amazing chapter in his book about passenger pigeons at a time when they were very predominant, which existed in our country in these mega flocks of billions of birds. And this is what John James Audubon said about it. He said, "The dung lay several inches deep, covering the whole extent of the roosting place. Many trees 2 feet in diameter were broken off at no great distance to the ground, and the branches of many of the largest and tallest had given way, as if the forest, that should say, had been swept by a tornado." And so this is an example of a species now extinct from the earth, passenger pigeons, having a huge impact on forests by creating a large disturbance. So this is a disturbance which is no longer present on our landscape, and we now understand that disturbances are really, really important for the way that forests grow and develop. So this is an example of how a change in wildlife wrought by human land use change ultimately has caused a change in the forest that we have today. But this is also true for many other species of wildlife. So another really important baseline to think about in our thinking about forests is this. So for some reason, everybody thinks about healthy forests as looking like this. This looks really nice to just about everybody. Excuse me. You know, you got these evenly spaced big trees. There's nothing growing in the understory of the forest. It looks beautiful. I don't know where this comes from, but it has nothing to do with how forests actually look. It has a lot to do with our misunderstanding of them and how we manage them. This is what healthy forests really look like. Healthy forests are not static. Like I said before, they are dynamic. They're always changing. Death, disturbance, change in the forest are these incredibly abundant sources of life. They're the way that we get new generations of trees, and our forests become more diverse and complex over time, which we associate with all these other things, from really, really good wildlife habitat, excellent bird habitat for different species of birds which like to nest in all different layers of the canopy and hunt in these canopy gaps that are created by these disturbances, to them sequestering and storing more carbon, them having more productive soils. All of these things are synonymous not with forests which are unchanging, but with forests that are dynamic. And our best clue as we think about what forests are supposed to, in air quotes, look like, is to look at old forests. So in looking at the remnant old growth forests in our region, and there are not many, we understand or have a better idea about how forests sort of manage themselves. And so, yes, there are big old trees. Probably we all know that. You know, these are forests in which these large-scale disturbances have been largely absent, so the trees are allowed to get big. But they also have a high degree of what we call structural complexity and diversity. And what that means is many different sizes and ages of trees. So it's not a monolith. It's not everything all the same. It's this incredibly complex, diverse abundance of tree species, and tree species growing in different ways, in different sizes, ages, generations of trees. There are natural canopy gaps. There's dead wood on the ground and dead standing trees. And in general, diversity abounds. So it's this sort of idea, you know, if you walked into an old forest, in many cases, and I've done it, I've led a tour in an area of Charlotte, which was never completely cleared. It may have been logged at some point, but it has these areas which are ostensibly old growth. And I led a group of people in there, and as soon as we walked out of the area that had been a field 100 years ago and into that old growth area, someone said, "Oh, I don't like that." And what they were responding to was just how messy it looked. There was just dead trees on the ground, and it was thick in the understory, and just all different kinds of strange, different species of trees intermixed and growing in different ways, which is really an expression of forest health, not of messiness. So why do we care? So one of the really interesting things about thinking about old forests and thinking about how forests are sort of supposed to grow or how they manage themselves is, you know, it seems to be kind of good for everything. So you can break it down and say, well, we know that diverse, uneven-aged forests, like these old growth forests with all those old growth attributes, are more resilient to climate change, to natural disturbances. We also know that because they're presenting all these different sizes and ages and species and different structures of trees growing in different ways, they have more opportunities for wildlife. You know, there are different bird species who nest in shrub layers, who nest in the canopy, who utilize all different sizes and shapes of trees at different times in their life cycle. So it stands to reason, and this is true, that a more diverse forest with different ages and sizes of trees will present more opportunities for different species of birds. We also know that multi-age forests sequester and store more carbon. And we know that if we're sort of thinking about forest as a complete system, that managing forests like they manage themselves captures more of the bigger picture of what forests are all about and the parts of them that are important, which is every part. And I would also make this argument for intrinsic value. This one isn't for everybody, but I would say, why would we not want to grow forests like they grow themselves? You know, it seems like there is intrinsic value. There is value of growing forests like this, independent of the individual resources that they're providing, just because that's how forests grow. And another Aldo Leopold quote: "The last word in ignorance is the man who says of an animal or a plant, what good is it?" And I think this is true also for the system of forests. As I alluded to in my introduction, it's also important to grow healthy forests in general, because healthy forests produce public benefits. So forests are providing the context for pretty much everything that's great about Vermont, and also everything that keeps us alive, right? So they're cleaning our air, cleaning our water, they're sequestering and storing the carbon that we're emitting. They're also making Vermont beautiful, which is probably one of the reasons why many of us want to live here. They're also providing us with amazing places to recreate. They're providing the context for pretty much our entire lives. As I said, many of these forests are privately owned, but the benefits that they're producing are enjoyed by us all. And so here's a breakdown. Again, this is context of Vermont's landscape: 75% forested, about 80% privately owned by families, individuals. Our total forest cover, you know, here in our sheltered little part of the world, is decreasing by about 2,000 acres a year. Our rate of development, measured in terms of area, is increasing about twice as fast as our population. So basically what that just means is that we're not developing efficiently. Our average parcel size is decreasing, and our number of landowners is increasing, which means essentially that our landscape is getting broken up into smaller and smaller pieces. But we also need, you know, in this sort of that idea, the radical forest manager tenet of that we need to zoom out, we also need to consider the global landscape that we're a part of. Globally, we have rapid global forest cover loss. We're in the middle of a mass extinction of species and a mass loss of global biodiversity. The US is about less than 5% of global population and about a third of global consumption, and that resource consumption is increasing. Climate and resource extraction and consumption are disproportionately affect poorer and more vulnerable communities globally. And so there's these ideas of environmental justice, climate justice, which basically just means that, or recognizes that your ability to have a clean environment, to have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink, is largely a function of where you live, how impoverished you are, and other things about you of which you have no control. And so that's a really, really important thing to think about as we go into these next ideas. I also wanted to sort of bring the context of this mass extinction to light. So we're in a geologic era, which many call the Anthropocene, which is basically in which humans are the dominant influence on our climate and our global ecology. It's resulting in this massive constriction of biodiversity. We have literally 50% less animals, our global animal populations. That doesn't mean 50% of the species have got extinct. It means we have literally 50% of the number of animals on Earth as there were in 1970. And we have an extinction rate which is between 10 and 10,000 times the background rate. So that's the rate that would be occurring sort of independent of human interference on the landscape. And behind that, I have that picture of that eastern elk, which used to be roaming through Vermont's forest prior to European settlement, now extinct. And so in the midst of all of these are the questions that I ask just about everybody that I talk to about forests. And so, and I really want to know the answer. So the question is, can management, active management, where we're putting ourselves into these systems, have a positive influence on forests? And can managing Vermont's forests have a positive influence on our world? I think the answer is yes. Another Aldo Leopold. I think it's really important that as we think about how we can be interacting with our ecosystems, with our forests in a way that's really positive, think about this concept of a land ethic. So, quote, the land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, animals, collectively the land. You could also insert the forest in this. A land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for fellow members and also respect for the community as such. So I don't think that recognizing, this idea of the land ethic has to be this sort of like hippy dippy idea. I think what it is just a recognition that we are physically tied to our landscape, and whether we want to or not, we're in relationship with it because it's literally providing the means for us to live on this planet. Again, bringing up intrinsic value, I think if I were to ask any of you, do forests have the right to exist independent of their value to us? I think you would say yes. I also really like this idea. I read the book Braiding Sweetgrass recently by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which is a really special book, largely about essentially land ethic. And she articulated this idea of, we here in America think of land ownership as a bundle of rights, but you could also think about it as coming with those bundle of rights, a bundle of responsibilities. So do you have a responsibility to take care of that land that you own in addition to just being able to, extract things from it? And so in this service, I'm really into this idea of ecological forest management. I call it also regenerative forest management because, like regenerative agriculture, it's actually seeking to enrich the forest by managing it rather than just simply extracting from it. And the big ideas are that you manage forests like they manage themselves, not placing a construct on it that's more comfortable to us or that's more efficient for us to extract from, but to actually say, let's manage forests like they manage themselves. So we're managing for many different ages, sizes, and species of trees. We're retaining lots of dead wood. We're retaining big old trees. We call them biological legacy trees on every acre. And we're creating also small pockets of early successional habitat and other unique conditions with landscape level importance. And of course, we're protecting sensitive, unusual features, habitat for rare, threatened, endangered species, stuff like that. And so that's really powerful because it's helping forests, which, in the case of Vermont, many of our forests are even aged. Many of our forests are much less diverse than the forest prior to European settlement. Through interjecting ourselves in that system, we can help those forests more closely resemble like old growth forests, more closely resemble the forest that would have preceded European settlement in Vermont. At the same time doing all this other really, really positive stuff. And there's actually a couple of UVM professors, Tony D'Amato and Bill Keaton, both of them have been producing some really amazing work about managing forests actively to be more like old growth forests, which I think is really powerful. And so here's this other idea. So we all know, many of us, depending on where you're from, have probably heard horror stories about logging, right? Like logging's bad, logging's something of the past, logging's extractive. People have gone to an area that was logged and was done in a really bad way, and they have all these horror stories about it. But in terms of placing ourselves in that global context, think about managing our forests in that way that I talk about, in this really like progressive way where we're encouraging diversity and resilience and managing our forests in this incredibly thoughtful way that is actually helping reverse the impacts of human land use. Well, if we're doing that, then isn't the wood that we're harvesting like a local renewable resource? And don't we love those? And in many ways, comparing it to like agriculture, it's even better because it's occurring within this living system, which is going to continue to provide wildlife habitat and all these other things. Every field that we're farming is in some ways a compromise to ecology because that's the site of a clear-cut forest or a drained wetland. Well, we can continue to manage our forest for local renewable resources without doing that. And I think it's also important to recognize that we're not headed towards, even in the best case scenario, we're not headed towards a point where we're just going to stop consuming resources. We're always going to be consuming resources. So let's think about what resources do we want to support? And let's think about one of the most powerful things about local resources is not just it allows us to lower the climate costs and the carbon output of transporting those things. It's also that these things happen here. We get to keep an eye on these things here. In many cases, we're saying, no, I don't like logging. I'm not going to, support this in my backyard. At the same time, we're still consuming resources, and what the resources we're consuming are less high quality resources. They're probably non-local, non-renewable resources, and we're just displacing the impacts of our resource use somewhere else in the world. So remember that idea of environmental justice. So we have the privilege, right, to say no logging in my neck of the woods, and instead to say we're going to support mountaintop removal somewhere else, or we're going to support fossil fuel extraction somewhere else. And so I think that that's an incredibly important thing that we think about, and that we understand that your choices, whether it's to consume a resource, to produce a resource or not, all of those choices have impacts. It also has local impacts in terms of helping our private landowners afford to own land. So remember, all of those benefits from those 80% of our forested lands, which are owned by private landowners, those are landowners who are paying taxes on those lands and paying for non-commercial management expenses. That can be very expensive, and we want to make it so that not only so that those lands, people aren't forced to sell and develop those lands because they can't afford to own them, but we also want to make it so that everybody can afford to own land. And so allowing landowners to make a little bit of income periodically also has a lot of positive benefits. So I empower people to say, yes, in my backyard, even though it's uncomfortable, even though, logging is something that I've always thought of as something that I don't like. I think that it's really radical to think about taking charge of your resources in that way. And so all of these things are occurring in an environment of, all of this history, all of these sort of global conditions and contexts are occurring in an environment of many threats to our forests. And here's a few of them. I'm going to go through a few of them one by one. Climate change gets special treatment because it's so scary. So what's the problem with climate change? In general, sort of climate change imposes many stressors on our forests and on our other ecosystems. They support basically all of these other really scary things that are happening are exacerbated by climate change. Forests are simultaneously part of how we solve that problem. So forests can help buffer the effects of climate change. They can sequester carbon. They can provide refugia for our wildlife that are threatened by climate change, and a means for our climate to change in a way that is less dire to our native species. But they're also themselves extremely at risk and threatened by factors of climate change. Many other forest health threats are also linked to climate change. And so there's this new idea of managing for forest carbon. This diagram on the right is really important to understand where the carbon in the forest is. So most of that, the carbon is in the forest floor and the dead wood that's on the forest floor. So soil organic carbon is about 58% of the carbon in our forests. Forest floor litter is 6%, down dead wood 2%, standing dead trees 1%. Only 32% of the carbon in our forest is actually in living trees. So a lot of this is carbon which is actually accrued by these, again, forest systems over time as multiple generations of trees come and go. You can manage forests for carbon in a bunch of different ways. Surprise, it's all the same stuff that we talked about, managing for all these other things. And it's also basically managing for forests which are more like old growth forests by increasing the diversity, both structural and species diversity in the forest, retaining big trees, so not just cutting trees every time they get big, avoiding large scale disturbances and leaving lots of dead wood on the ground, and just in general protecting the long-term health of the forest. I will say, to be candid, the research suggests that if you're just purely thinking about the most carbon that you can store in a forest, the most carbon storage will be from no management. So no cutting, just letting the forest develop over time. But a really interesting thing about that is when we broaden our context and think about environmental justice and think about wildlife habitat, mass extinctions, the fact that many of our bird species are in decline, the calculus on that changes a little bit. So you need to think not just of the quantity, but also of sort of quality. So managing for maximum quantity of carbon does not necessarily protect qualitative benefits like wildlife habitat, like human health, equity, and justice, these other things which may be supported by doing some management. We really want to manage, this is sort of a buzzword in forestry now, we want to manage forests that are resilient. So that's another really important way that we combat climate change in practice, as we do all these other things. And what resilient forests are is basically forests capable of maintaining their health and natural processes throughout great stress, as we expect to come out of climate change, and with other attendant related stressors like natural disturbances of increased frequency and intensity. How do we do that? Surprise, by encouraging diversity, complexity, and we do that by driving disturbances. So intervening in these systems, again, in a very thoughtful and careful way to make forests more diverse sooner than they would naturally, and understanding that the climate is changing on a timeline that is not ideal, but that we can make these forests more diverse now. Another way that we can do it is by protecting them from invasive exotic plants, pests, pathogens that are uniformly human created problems. Protect them from fragmentation, forest loss, development, and in general, protect their long-term health and productivity. Invasive plants, excuse me. So as we think about holistically how to make our forests more resilient, how to make them more healthy in the long term so that they can continue to provide all these benefits that we rely on, like carbon sequestration and storage, like wildlife habitat, we need to address some problems. One of the big ones that I deal with all the time is these problems of invasive plants. These plants decrease the diversity of a system. So remember how pretty much everything I've said up until now has said diversity is the most important thing. Invasive plants decrease ecosystem diversity, resiliency, health, and the ability of forests to do pretty much everything because they displace our native species, and because we understand that forests are these dynamic systems which change over time. How they do that is by there being disturbances and then there being subsequent regeneration. Well, native species can't regenerate if they're completely blocked by these invasive plants, which very aggressively take over and just form these monocultures, usually in the understory of forests. These invasive plants are also known to basically benefit from every other part of climate change. So they're huge winners with natural disturbances of increased intensity and frequency. They are also huge winners as aerial carbon increases. They'll be able to grow more quickly. They are also, what was I going to say? They basically, in every case, they're basically just going to become more dominant and not less. Oh, they're more able to take advantage of longer growing seasons. So even now, you're probably seeing many of the invasive plants in your woodlot or forest that you frequent are leafing out sooner than our native species, and they're basically almost all of these species are able to take advantage of these longer growing seasons. So this is something that's really hard for people, and so this is an example of one of those tenets of the radical forest manager, where you need to sometimes do stuff you don't think you have to do, or that you're uncomfortable with. In many cases, targeted minimal use of herbicide is the only feasible way to address infestations at any scale. So I think of herbicide now not only this way, but also as a restoration tool, because these species, in many cases, are almost impossible to kill. And so, and they are such an existential threat to our forests and their function and their health that using this tool, which in many other ways is misapplied or is applied sort of in exactly the opposite direction of where we want to go, can actually support these incredibly abundant, important, vibrant processes associated with forests. And so in many ways, what I've come to see is that it's way more radical to think in a nuanced way about herbicide and be willing to use it where it's necessary to protect our forests than it is to just say, well, I don't like that. I'm never gonna think about that again. This is one of those things where we need to understand with eyes wide open the threats that are facing our forests and do what's necessary to address them, not even for us, for these systems in and of themselves. In a global context, just to sort of place that in context, along with habitat loss and climate change, biological invasion, so invasive pests, plants, animals, are a major threat to global diversity. They account for about half of all extinctions, of which the cause is known. And according to the National Wildlife Federation, 42% of endangered species are primarily threatened by invasive organisms. Now, all of these other threats, landscape level threats, are really, really, really scary. Climate change obviously is like huge. But one of the ones that really keeps me up at night is forest loss. And so the development of forests, parcelization, fragmentations, the splitting of our forests into smaller and smaller pieces, and the converting of our forests into other uses. Here you see a picture of someone's new house lot on top of a ridge top in Richmond. Forest loss is really, really scary because it scares me much more than, say, bad forest management, bad logging, because it's essentially permanent. And those forests that you've converted, that you've developed, and that you've split into teeny tiny pieces with roads, houses, stuff like that, those are areas that will never sequester and store carbon again, never provide wildlife habitat again, never provide any of these other benefits that we know to be so important to us, as in our life as Vermonters, and also just as human beings on this planet. There are some things that you can do about it. One of the really weird things about Vermont is that many of these decisions about how we plan and develop our communities are done by volunteer committees, planning commissions, conservation commissions, development review boards. And you can advocate for, at the town level, you can advocate for preserving forested blocks as intact pieces and preventing large-scale conversion and the splitting up of forests into smaller and smaller pieces. Those commissions are always looking for more people, and one person, really advocating for something can really make a huge change in the way that your town is developed. And it's also important, I think it's incumbent upon us to try and conserve permanently with conservation easements as much land as we possibly can. This is something that is really, really hard to do, but I think it's really, really important. I've talked a couple times about this idea of sort of like quantitative versus qualitative change, quantitative versus qualitative benefit. And I think that it's really important that we, as we think about all of these things, so as we think about the way we manage our forests, the way we think about our forests, the way we think about our landscape, and the relationship between our forest and our forest management in this sort of global environment, which is so much bigger. It's important, obviously, that we save the world, but let's save the world while also protecting equity and justice for everyone, the right of all people to live a safe, healthy, and happy life. As we do this, let's also do it while making it qualitatively better for everybody. And to bring us out, another quote by Aldo Leopold. He says, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." And I think that's true for our forests, and I think that's true for us as well. And with that, I would love to take some of your questions. Thank you so much for listening to that. What do you think, Gwen?
I don't see any questions in the chat at this point. So anyone who has a question, go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself and have a conversation with Ethan here. Crickets. Ed, yes.
I got one for you here.
Hey, Ed.
This is a conceptual idea. Hi, Ethan. Thank you for that awesome presentation.
Thanks.
I really appreciate the opportunity to connect. Talking about just the intrinsic value of like leaving forest to grow just indefinitely. And thinking about like how much of a part of forestry and logging is a part of our, what Vermont is, and trying to preserve that. And how can we incentivize folks to make that leap, to get radical, to use your word, you know what I mean? To like, can you use a use value program where there is no harvest? Like, what it will actually, then does that get tricky from your perspective,
Yeah.
Anyways, there you go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough. So a lot of this stuff is just really nuanced. And one of the one part of that, of how we do that, is by helping everybody have a more nuanced understanding of what forest management is. So like, I know that when I was growing up, it wasn't something that was part of like my community. It wasn't I just sort of knew about it peripherally, and I was like, oh yeah, logging's bad, right? I like forests, and so one of the goals of this presentation and of a lot of the work that I do is sort of to get people to at least engage with a little bit more nuance about forest management, understanding that forestry doesn't have to be this like extractive thing which is like necessarily degrading your forest. It can also be like this incredibly regenerative, positive thing which can support other things that we care about, while sort of like producing a resource which is really, really great, right? So part of it is that I think I really want, one of the hard things about logging is that there's sort of like many things, there's this sort of polarization around it, where there are some people who are like, many people who are like, logging is completely not okay, right? Under any circumstances. And there are other people who are like, logging is completely okay under any circumstances. And both of those are completely inappropriate, right? Like neither of those reflect the incredibly like vast array of different ways that people can engage with their land and manage their land actively in a way that is positive or negative. And so I think that that's really important. And just for us to understand, for it not to just be like logging is the territory of the loggers, like we all also have a stake in the way our forests are managed, again, because the forests are producing all these public benefits. And so I think the way we incentivize people to manage their forests better is partially just by like giving forests and giving forestry back to the people. And saying like, this isn't a thing that belongs to like, loggers who you saw when you were driving by on the dirt road who looked like a bunch of gruff guys. It belongs to all of us, and it can be something that we all engage in. So that's sort of where I'm, part of what I'm trying to do. The other thing I would mention, because you mentioned leaving forests alone, like forming this nuance, right? Where like there are people who are like, no forest should ever be cut. And then, there are people who are like, all forests should always be cut. And, the responsible, with sort of all of these ideas, the responsible idea is somewhere in the middle. So like, I think that forestry can be amazing, and that cutting of trees can be this incredibly powerful, profound, positive thing. But I also really like the idea of, on our landscape, having some forests that are unmanaged. And so I think that cultivating diversity is not just something we do within an individual forest, but it's also something we do across the landscape. And so, I think it needs to be in the discussion that we think about that we can discuss all of those things at the same time, and it doesn't have to be sort of all one thing or all the other thing. I think that's sort of a rambling answer to your question, Ed, but it's a lot. There's a lot there, and incentivizing it. I think about there's this idea, many of you may have heard of this idea of ecosystem services. So like many of the benefits that I talked about forest providing, public benefits providing for all of us, these things have value. And we just haven't figured out how to like turn that value into like a monetary value. And there's all these different ideas about how we actually do that. But I think about some of the work that I do in talking to people like you guys, as trying to help people internalize those values morally so that they have a better understanding of the way that their land and the way that they manage it has impacts that go way beyond just them, and so that they'll make better decisions, or more robust decisions, have a more robust thought process around it.
We have a few more questions in the chat here. So we have a question from Elizabeth, and she's asking, do you have conflict with people or organizations, whoops, I'm scrolling here, who want to cut forests to install solar arrays? And how do you argue the benefits of leaving the forests uncut?
Whoa. I haven't run into that personally. I've understood that that's something that some people think is sort of on the horizon, something we're going to have to deal with more in the future. I don't know, the thing about like forest and solar arrays kind of do the same thing, right? They're both turning sunlight into energy in different ways. Solar arrays do it probably more prolifically. But then it's what they don't do is like all of the other stuff that forests do, right? And so, but at the same time, mitigating the impacts of non-renewable energy sources is also positive. So like there are feedbacks when you clear cut a forest, maybe to put in a big solar farm, there are also feedbacks that may be positive from mitigating climate change, from preventing the use of more harmful resources elsewhere, which will then feed back into surrounding forests. It's a tough question. I don't think I can give you a straight up answer. It's just complicated. I think there should be forests everywhere, and that we should just have forests all over the place. But it's more complicated.
So there's a question about invasive species from Michelle, asking, as landowners, how do we identify and help control invasive species? And wondering if it's best to contact their local forester for advice.
Yeah, these invasive exotic plants are really, really tough to deal with, as you can tell, which if they weren't, and I promise you, if they weren't tough to deal with, I wouldn't be advocating for the use of herbicide. It's just that, and this is the reason why basically every conservation partner in Vermont advocates for the use of herbicide with invasive exotic plants, because the stakes are too high, and it's pretty much the only way to kill them at any scale. And so it's this like really weird, sort of nuanced relationship that we have with them, which is why I'm advocating for it. I'm not like an herbicide salesman or anything like that. You can find more information about how to manage them at vtinvasives.org. That's a really great site that's run by the state of Vermont, including and fact sheets on how to identify them. And so just to make your life easier, there's a lot of different invasive plants. Probably the big ones that you're going to find in the woods are going to be shrub honeysuckle, common buckthorn, multiflora rose, Japanese barberry, maybe glossy buckthorn, garlic mustard. So if you learn probably those 6, and there's a couple other ones, but those are like the big ones that I see all the time. And if you don't know any of them, and you study up on the fact sheets that they have on vtinvasives.org on those 6 species, you'll be in really good shape for managing or knowing what species are there. And then you can also look up resources on how to manage them. I also now, as a result of our new virtual world that we're all living in, I have a YouTube channel. You can search for Chittenden County Forester on YouTube. And I have a webinar that I did just on invasives, including their identification and their management. I also have a video that I created about how to do the type of herbicide application that I do on invasives. It's called a cut stump application with this tool called a buckthorn blaster, which is amazing. It's basically using the teeniest, tiniest, most minimal amount of herbicide to kill a plant. And you can find that on my YouTube channel as well.
All right, thanks. So there's a question about whether you share your approaches with others in different states or with anyone working in federal conservation organizations.
Yeah, I mean, we're all on the same team, and I think that, like, this presentation, the Radical Forest Manager, which I really care about and which I'm developing and changing all the time, it is not necessarily like the ecological or regenerative forest management ideas that I talk about. I didn't invent those. Those are the product of really amazing forest scientists like Tony D'Amato and Bill Keaton and others, and years of really intensive study of how forests work and how forest management work, and so those are in practice by consulting private foresters in Vermont and elsewhere. And the other aspects are just sort of different ways of thinking about our impact on the landscape. But yeah, I work with state and federal partners. I work with people in other states as well. I'll tell you what, if you work with people from any state south of us, they'll be like, oh my God, how is everything in your Vermont's forest so easy, right? Because if you go south, all of these problems that we have, whether it's invasive exotic plants, overpopulation of deer, which we didn't even talk about, which is a huge problem, development, all of these things are like so much worse down there. And so we have the opportunity now, in comparison, to do something about these problems before they become overwhelming. The hard thing is that before they're really bad, it's hard to like vindicate people and like really make people interested in dealing with them until they're like completely untenable. And then you're like, I can't do anything about this. This is too hard.
All right, so we have a question from Tom. If you do logging to increase forest diversity, can you also increase carbon storage and sequestration when extracting those trees? Yeah,
so the answer is yes and no. So I want to be like really clear that there's by Bill Keaton and Jared Nunnery, there's a really important paper about basically logging as compared to no logging under a bunch of different logging regimes and frequencies of entering with the logging equipment, stuff like that. The highest carbon scenario is always no cutting. So, and that's just, it makes perfect sense, right? Because you're like, when you're harvesting, you're removing trees, carbon, from the forest. And what I think is really important to recognize is that there's also other like qualitative benefits of harvesting, which are also should be accounted for and which are not necessarily captured by a purely quantitative recognition of that. But in the long term, you actually can manage forests to store more carbon. You can do that in a few different ways. So again, not just cutting all the big trees, leaving big trees in the forest is really, really important. When you create large openings, like big, like over a couple of acres, which again, we do sometimes because for the qualitative reason of there are specific species like American woodcock and ruffed grouse that are in decline on our landscape, which require early successional habitat, and young forest early successional habitat is underrepresented across our landscape as a result, again, of these huge landscape-wide things, mostly human land use, right? And the effects of it long, many decades afterwards. And so we can, by avoiding, when you create these large-scale disturbances, what happens is all that carbon in the soil gets very quickly volatilized. So it gets digested, the soil gets really hot, all those anaerobic and bacteria and fungi, everything is basically digesting that soil organic carbon and re-releasing it as carbon dioxide. So when you create larger disturbances, you're gonna release some of that soil carbon as carbon dioxide. So by avoiding that, you can also retain more carbon. We also know that in general, multi-age forests store more carbon than even-age forests. So by sort of pushing it along into an uneven age condition, in the long term, you can sequester more carbon. That's not to say that multi-age forests, which are harvested, don't sequester or don't store less carbon than ones that are not harvested, because again, no management is the most carbon. Another way that I like to think about it that is also really important to understand is that managing for resilient forests, forests which are resilient to climate change and natural disturbances, is also really, really important in thinking about carbon, because by creating a more resilient forest, even if to get the forest into that resilient condition, you've released some carbon in the process by doing some management, you're buffering yourself from large-scale disturbances in the future. So what happens, what we see in many cases now, we have these like big windstorms, right? And these big windstorms create all this damage. They knock over all these areas of trees and stuff. Those trees that are knocked over in these big windstorms, and in turn, the effect of those windstorms, those trees are, the effect of those windstorms is increased by the fact that those trees are disproportionately even-aged monocultures, so which are growing there as a result of recovering from past human land use. And so by making our forests more diverse, we basically are going to prevent them from being disproportionately affected by any one stressor or any one natural disturbance, which will in turn prevent them from experiencing these large disturbances, which will end up in the release of a lot of carbon.
I got a little follow-up on that too. So if you have a cutting cycle of 30 or 40 years, is that going to store more carbon than a 20-year cutting cycle? Is that a general rule that you can follow or not?
I don't think, I'm not sure what, that would have to look to the research for that. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah, but when I think about that carbon, and again, this is a really important thing to think about. So I would argue that as we're making our forests more resilient, the forests that we're creating have intrinsic value, and they also have all these other qualitative benefits, even if in the process of creating that, we're losing like a little bit of carbon. And I like to liken it to the way that stream ecologists think about managing streams. So they think about taking these streams, our streams are disproportionately straightened, deepened, channelized, and they want it to make them more stable and protect our water quality and aquatic habitat in the long term. They want to help the streams sort of retake these meanders. And they call it reaching a state of equilibrium, which is in the long term more stable. But to get to equilibrium, erosion will necessarily occur. So you say, okay, but this place where we're going, equilibrium, is worth being. And so we're saying, okay, a little bit of erosion, even if that's not what we want in the long term, is okay. And so that's sort of how I think about managing our forests. We're saying, even if we expend a little bit of carbon, if in the long term we're making our forests more stable, it will be positive.
All right, it looks like we have time for just one more question, and it's a nitty-gritty question. And from Ed asking, is it better to roll or skid your logs out of the woods?
Well,
oh, maybe it's not an easy one.
What do you mean, Ed? I think rolling them out of the woods would take a lot more time. I think, Ed, you're talking about forwarding them out of the woods, right? Yeah, so there's these ideas. You're muted right now, of course, but yeah, so there's this idea of, the way that most loggers get wood out of the woods is with something called a skidder. It's called a skidder because they hold up the big end of the log, and the small end of the log or the small end of the tree drags or skids on the ground. There is also a piece of equipment called a forwarder. A forwarder picks up logs with a claw and puts them on a bunk and then rolls them out of the woods on tracks or on wheels. And so there's there's sort of one of the neat things about a forwarder is you're potentially causing less soil disturbance because you're not skidding the back end of that log on the ground. Could potentially prevent some erosion, stuff like that. Forwarders can also be really, really heavy because they're just carrying everything, huge loads of logs on that bunk. And so they can also potentially cause more soil disturbance. It's a trade-off. There are different parts that are good about both of them. ecosystems.
All right. Well, I wanted to thank everyone for spending the time here this evening, and a huge thank you to Ethan for your expertise and your time, and for really doing all the work to think about forests in a very different way, and to help people really consider wildlife, especially for Audubon, considering birds and how we think about our forests.
Thanks, Gwen, and thanks, Sarah. And I want to say one more thing, which is that all of us are trying to figure out during this time and all other times, we're trying to figure out ways to like help you guys understand, all of you, you know, sort of all of you out there, to help you understand our ecosystems, our wildlife, how we can be better managers of our land. And there's a lot of partners that want to give you that information and provide you with opportunities to learn that stuff. And so I would really recommend subscribing to newsletters, liking them on social media, following them on social media of organizations like Audubon Vermont, the Vermont Land Trust, Vermont Coverts, the Vermont Woodlands Association, Vermont Fish and Wildlife. These are all Cold Hollow to Canada. These are all really amazing organizations that we're all on the same team, and we're all just trying to work together to help you understand this world that we live in a little better. I also have an email list. You can just email me at ethan.tapper@vermont.gov, and if you want to be on that, and I'll put you on it, and I'll let you know the stuff that I'm doing as well.
All right, thanks again. And I will, like I said earlier, I'm going to save the chat and send it out to everybody to the email addresses you provided. So thank you so much for being here this evening.
Thanks, Gwen. Thanks, Audubon.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.